We will now be hearing prepared speeches. Our first speaker will be Lisa Avedon. Lisa's working on Project 3. Get to the point. This project is from the Competent Communication Manual. The title of her speech today is Leave a Legacy of Wow. She's been a member of Toastmasters for 10 months, although has had extensive teaching experience. Let's find out why Lisa chose this particular topic. Please welcome Lisa.
I hadn't planned on talking about Glenn, but I want to add a little something before I start this speech. Glenn was my mentor when I first began in this club, and he was wonderful in taking me under his wing, giving me step by step of how this club works. And Glenn is leaving a legacy for me in many different ways. His empathy, his compassion, and his warmth and his welcoming nature really helped me fit into this club so nicely. So, Glenn, that's for you. Thank you. Now to get on to the regular programming. It was a spring day in 1958, and in one of the largest Catholic churches in the city, a priest walked up to the pulpit, and he stood in front of this packed congregation and looked out and saw that it was wall-to-wall people. It was standing room only, where they let the doors of the church open in the back of this church so people spilled out onto the street. He stood up and he thanked the people who spoke before him. They had given stories. They talked about a legacy, and they made the congregation, of all things, laugh. It was a funeral, and people were laughing. The warmth and the generosity and the love of these stories spilled over. The people who spoke were talking about a man who laid in a casket next to this priest. And the priest shared that this man in the casket was one of his very dearest friends. And he was very moved as well. He spoke about how this man has grown up in the slum area of the city. He was the first generation Italian who had come over from Genoa, Italy, and many times with his brothers and sisters he had nothing to eat and hardly any clothes to wear. He grew up in a rough neighborhood. Some of his friends were Italian kids, some of them were Irish kids, all first generation. And his three very closest friends he grew up with. They backed each other up in business. They led each other through their lives. These three men, actually spoke at his funeral and were with him on the day he died in the hospital, where he had called them to the hospital. He knew he was dying. And he had asked his family to leave the room so these three men could come in and close the door and spend time settling business, but also reminiscing and saying goodbye. These three men made a promise to him that day. They said that his family would always be cared for. He never had to worry about the safety of his wife, Teresa, or his family. Other people stood up and talked about how he had started food kitchens, homeless shelters in the city, because he always remembered his roots, where he came from. He wanted to make sure that those people could survive and live. It was important to him. It was part of his legacy. That man in the casket was my great-grandfather. The priest went forward and talked about, there was one story that the family knew nothing about. You see, as my great-grandfather grew up and went through his business life, he kept some of the things he did secret for some reasons. Others was mostly because of a humbleness. He didn't believe you had to shout out everything you did for people. And the priest said this one story is something even my great-grandmother didn't know. A few years before his death, there was a fire in a family up in northern Minnesota near the Canadian border. It had hit all the papers. This family lost everything. They lost their home, 2 family members, and the youngest was a young girl who was 5 years old, and she was badly burned over 3/4 of her body. At the time, my great-grandfather, his youngest granddaughter, was 5, and it moved him. So he came to his good friend, the priest, and he said to him, I would like you to make quiet inquiries, and I'd like you to find out about this family. Who's helping them? I want to help them. And the people in the church listened to this story as the priest said, over the last few years, my great-grandfather had not only rebuilt their house, but paid for all the medical expenses for this child, anonymously. But because he died, the priest felt it was okay to tell this story. People were moved. It's part of his legacy. When, after his burial, people still talked about him. And I started to think about this story when we think about legacies of wow. I have heard that his voice was very deep, baritone voice. He loved to laugh. He had sparkly eyes. He was a big Italian man. And then when he would walk in a room, he would fill a room. I also knew that he was a shrewd businessman, not someone to be easily crossed. And he quietly put people in as governor. He quietly put people into government behind the scenes. But this was a man that was loved. Why? Why do I know this? I never met him. I wasn't alive in 1958, even though my crow's feet beg to differ. Because he left a legacy. Our legacies are our stories. They're stories that we share. They're stories that people share about us. And why do they do that? As people, we humans love storytelling. We love knowing about where we come from. I know where I come from because of the stories that are passed down by the family. Now, they're not always good, but the ones that we pass on tend to be good. A few years ago, I sat in that same church where my last grandparent had passed away, my great-grandfather's daughter-in-law, my grandmother, and it was packed to the rafters, people standing on the back of the walls, probably much like my great-grandfather's funeral. And I started thinking, all the memories and all the love that my grandmother had poured out into life was much like my great-grandfather's. And I hope mine, and I hope yours. What stories will people tell about you that will leave a legacy of wow? Wow meaning your stories that they'll pass on. What legacy are you leaving? What legacy am I leaving? It's food for thought, and it's storytelling to share.